Okay, here we are. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Todd Verrill. I'm with the IQ Business Group, and I am very happy to be your moderator for our wonderful webinar today. What if information was an asset? Implementing ECRM into Microsoft 365 to support comprehensive information governance. Folks, we've got a great show for you today. I am joined by Ryan Britton, who is a senior Microsoft consultant, and my colleague with IQBG Marketing, Maggie Vandenberg. And it looks like Ryan is in charge of slides, and that's why they're not advancing. That's just a joke, Ryan.
Apologies, there we go.
One more, sir. Thank you. Okay, IQBG and Mint are very proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including federal, state, local, education, academia, and our private sector friends seeking knowledge and insight to make the most of your Microsoft 365 investment. Before we dive into what we're calling What's So Smart About This Thing we'll introduce as Smart Compliance, I do need to mention a couple of housekeeping items. By default, all participants' mics are muted, but please do submit any questions through the webinar chat. And today's webinar will be made available to all participants for replay within 24 hours. Please be on the lookout for our email notification. So for folks who have joined us before, hey, thanks for coming back. We appreciate it. For those who we have not had the pleasure of meeting, welcome. IQBG, the IQ Business Group is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, we've been passionate about developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors that leverage people, process, and technology to support your requirements. And our great partners at Mint, take it away, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Todd. So Mint is a global Microsoft partner, which has multiple gold competencies across a wide variety of disciplines. We have a 20-year history of success in partnering with Microsoft and providing services on Microsoft software. And we're certainly very delighted to be assisting in presenting this webinar today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much and welcome. I love it when we do these together. Ryan, let's frame up the problem here, what we're going to talk about today. Folks on the call are likely faced with lots of information management challenges. That hasn't changed. They need to support business and compliance requirements. Here's the deal. Terms like ECRM and enterprise information management have all but shifted to what we experience daily, especially during COVID times, as content services and something known as the information ecosystem. This is our modern workplace. And, I think while there might be some blurred lines, so to speak, between apps and products, let's face it, they're all connected. And this poses a challenge. What does this mean? If it wasn't difficult enough to do before, making sufficient progress in developing information governance programs is quite the chore given our current scenario. Something to share with you, Ryan and Maggie, the latest ARMA IG Information Governance Maturity Index data shows just that. One key thing they measure is something called authorities. These would be the elements, if you will, that serve as the guide rails for your organization's IG efforts. And we're seeing a pretty good downward trend in authorities, meaning just 30% report their maturity level of proactive or transformational, while 70% report essential, maturity, or below. And this is what we see as the difference between a proactive approach and a reactive approach. And it's really important to keep this in mind because these authorities are not static. You know, the more that has changed, the more work there is for us to do. I'll throw it out to everyone on the call. Think of your own email space and your team space, and you can probably comprehend about how your email behavior is now comparative to collaborative tools behavior. And we see this challenge, and this is where IQBG and Mint come in, because we're focused on the information management shift and on the growth of content services and Microsoft 365. We know that now more than ever, our connected world requires a more outcome-focused approach so we can plan, manage, and govern the apps, products, and services that drive our business. And this is the time we'd like to introduce Smart Compliance. It's an outcome as a service offering designed to provide a turnkey solution for compliance and governance within this new modern workplace. And we do this through a combination of three things: expert consultation, industry best practices, and managed services. Ryan, to me, this is pretty exciting stuff, because Smart Compliance, when you look at this cog, it provides this holistic framework, but it can be dissected per a specific need or function or component based on requirements. And to me, Smart Compliance is developed more on that global scale approach, kind of like the ARMA RIM index. So it can be applied to anyone regardless of industry or sector. I think that's a real value add. And also, whatever the desired outcome is, we are always focusing on that proactive approach instead of the all too common reactive approach. When I look at this, I know this is a buzzword right now, but to me, this really is the design thinking approach to information management that tries to help us align those modern workspace content services functions with traditional regulatory ECRM needs that we have been faced with. And I'm going to stop talking. That takes us to today's topic one of Smart Compliance, which is information governance. Information governance, as you all know, is quite a broad topic, but it's probably one of the most important to help us frame up Smart Compliance. So folks, strap yourselves in as we gain some valuable insight from Ryan, who will share with us a lot, but specifically how to get to step 8 and a very nifty proposition at the end of our presentation. Take it away, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Todd. It's always a pleasure to present with you, and this is such an exciting topic for those of us who are excited about the changes that we're seeing in information governance. Probably a good place to start when considering a webinar that's title is what if information was an asset, is to ask the question, is information an asset? And I would propose that we can put forward some questions that might help us to answer this question. So for those folks who are listening in, think about these questions and your own organizations and your own data as we go through them. First of all, do you back your data up? And I would say that if you're willing to back up your data and go to the expense of doing that, you see value in your information, and that's pretty much a no-brainer. Would you pay for its safe return? I've heard stories of folks who've been hit by ransomware attacks within their organization and have paid a ransom in order to get their information back. And would you pay for new information? Folks who are breaking into new industries or launching new products will pay a premium to get good statistics to help them position that product or to help them break into a market. And do you believe that intellectual property should be protected? I think most people are of the opinion that intellectual property is the internet currency of today. And finally, we recognize that time is money, and therefore information takes time to generate, it takes time to manage, and it is valuable for a period of time. So ultimately, time and information are both money. And hopefully that resonates with you folks as well. It's probably a good idea for us to look at the other side of that coin and ask the question, is information a liability? And if you think about it, today in today's media, we're seeing a lot of highly publicized cases where data breaches have cost high-profile organizations a good amount of money. And we might ask ourselves that same question: what would a data breach cost us if our organizations were compromised? And what is the exposure of your organization in an e-discovery case? If you've got large repositories of on-premise information that haven't been managed for a long period of time and have grown organically, and you had an e-discovery case where you were compelled to turn over certain information, what would your liability be in that case? And what is the risk of not protecting customer and citizen data under PII or CCPA or Brazil's LGBT or Europe's GDPR? The law now compels us to take responsibility for personal information and to have controls in place to be able to manage that information wherever it may lie. And finally, can a tort be enforced in a court of law? I read an interesting article the other day where they're seeing a rise in the number of cases where people are seeking damages for the fact that an organization did not properly manage their information or their organization's information in the case where it's a customer. And finally, have you considered cyber insurance? Or organizations are looking to cyber insurance to try and offset this liability. And so having posed these questions, I would hope that everyone could probably agree that information is both an asset and a liability. And there's some interesting facts that we can consider when talking about just how much of a liability and just how much of an asset information is. Some interesting facts on the liability side of things. There have been some very large fines, as we mentioned previously, that have been posed to go slapped onto companies who have had infringements from an information perspective. Equifax had to pay a $575 million fine, British Airways $230 million, Uber $150 million, Marriott $124 million, Capital One compromised 100 million customer records, Target reached an $18.5 million settlement for compromising 40 million of their customer records, and so it goes on. And while I'm sure that looking at this list, you might be thinking these high-profile organizations, an organization that is perhaps not as high-profile is unlikely to receive such a high fine. But by the same token, these organizations have the capital to be able to adequately prepare and mitigate these types of events happening. And they have been unable to do so in a lot of cases. And so this is a very real problem. There's some interesting stats on the right-hand side for your reference, things like considering whether or not you're at risk, where a recent survey showed that 53% of companies surveyed had over 1,000 sensitive files open to every employee. On average, every employee had access to 17 million files. Only 5% of folders were properly protected, and 61% of companies had over 500 accounts with non-expiring passwords. All scary things to consider when you think about the level of exposure that we're seeing in the media from a liability perspective. And finally, two factoids to take away with you when considering what is the cost. Recent research has shown that it can cost $3.9 million on average for a data breach for an organization, and that the average cost of a stolen record is $150 per record. So if you extrapolate that out over the number of citizens or the number of customers that you have in your care, you have a pretty good indication of what your liability would be if ever that information was obtained by a hacker. And so when considering the size of liability, we should also talk about the size of growth that we're seeing from an information perspective, and it's really meteoric. If you look at 2013, we had 4.4 zettabytes of information on the globe. We now have 44 zettabytes, 10 times as much in just 7 years of growth. If you look at the rise in the amount of data that is useful if analyzed, it's gone up from 22% to 37%. And I want you to remember that 37% of an organization's information, which is valuable, that you're seeing on the slide, because we're going to talk about it on the subsequent slide. And some additional things to think about: 27% of data is on mobile phones and on personal devices, and 10% of that is on embedded systems. And most notably, at the bottom of the slide, up to 90% of this information that we're talking about is unstructured data. In other words, files that are sitting in file shares or in cloud repositories and not rows inside of a database. So something to think about when considering what we've learned so far about information and its liability and its growth is that a percentage of every organization's data is also something called ROT, or dark data. And in industry terms, what this means is ROT is redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. And you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side with the iceberg that this can take up to 23% of an organization's data. And that's 65% of the data, which sits even further below the surface of the information sea, I suppose, is dark data, data that's hidden within networks, people, and machines, and is not even necessarily managed or made obvious to IT departments. And finally, you can see at the top there that 12% of data is business critical. And the question that I'd like to ask everyone on the call is, okay, 12% of data is business critical, but which 12%? Are you able to point to that 12% within your organization? Are you able to differentiate between your critical business data and your ROT and the dark data that lies beneath that? If you recall from a previous slide, 37% of the organization's data is useful. So besides the 12% that's obviously useful, of the 23% and 65% that is below the surface, a further portion of it, if it were properly categorized and properly analyzed, would actually be of benefit to the business. And finally, ROT costs every organization money. Do we know how much yours costs and how much you would save if you were able to adequately meet this? And finally, just from our own consulting, we've noticed a large number, a surprising number of organizations that have a save everything forever policy. They inherently know that information is valuable and they don't want to lose that valuable asset, but they don't know how to manage it appropriately, and so everything just gets maintained. So if you can think about it, it means that that iceberg, besides 12% that is critical and a potential further percentage below the surface that could be used to benefit the business, the rest of the information that is not useful is simply being maintained at a cost. And so that brings us to a situation which might look like the stockroom depicted on the right-hand side, where folks know that information is valuable. And if I can extend the metaphor a little bit further, as a result of that, we create these large informational storerooms and we put everything inside there in case we need it one day. And you can imagine, if you look at that graphic, that somewhere in there is information that is useful. But there is also information that is flammable, information that is incendiary, information that could cause a fire within our storeroom at any moment. And it really is important that we're able to differentiate between the two. And so as much as perhaps it is a bugbear for many organizations that maintain inventory to keep that inventory categorized and know how much stock they have of everything and have a shelf for everything and everything on its shelf, it's also potentially very valuable for organizations to take the same tack when it comes to their information. And so on the left-hand side of the slide, we've got some statements that kind of represent what we're finding as we work with organizations on their information governance strategy. And this may resonate with you. We find that organizations know that information is valuable and that compliance is no longer an optional investment. And they do have records management schedules and perhaps a system that assists them in managing that schedule. But compliance, according to that schedule, is low in most business units. And they would like to implement strategic information governance, but the volume is overwhelming and we don't know where to start. So we just keep everything by default and we're not sure what our liability is. And we could probably do a better job of maximizing the use of our information. And so that brings us to a discussion about the changing face of the information ecosystem, because besides the fact that we have this meteoric growth, and besides the fact that compliance and regulation is becoming tighter every day, at the same time, the landscape as we understand it, which forms information management, is changing as well. Historically, collaboration and records management systems were completely different systems. You had a system where folks would draft their documents and maintain it and share it. And at a point in time in that document's lifecycle, it would move into a system of record where it would be retained and reviewed and disposed of at a point in time. And that is changing. Those two worlds are colliding, and we're finding more and more that folks are expecting the entire document lifecycle to be something that you would review in totality. Even if there is still an external records management system, you want to think about the collaboration lifecycle of a document and the retention lifecycle of a document at the same time. Historically, identity was something that was managed per system or integrated superficially. So if you installed a records management system, you would have a set of users in there and you would have a set of roles in there, and that was okay. But more and more, we're finding that folks are looking for centralized identity, and all systems are expected to be able to integrate into that. So instead of having a login for this system and a login for my ERP system and a login for my records management system, we expect to have one cloud identity that I use to log into my laptop, log into all the systems I work on, and that is really becoming the expected status quo these days. We also find that historically security could be implemented at the perimeter, and that's in today's remote working environment almost impossible. You can't ring fence a physical location anymore and say everything inside of here is what we have to protect. It's spread on people's devices that they own personally across a large number of branches, and in work from home situations, even at people's houses. Historically, teamwork applications were ad hoc, informal, and formed part of shadow IT. So if you and I were working on a project, we may have a chat app on the side and we may collaborate across that app, but we certainly didn't consider that conversation a part of the corporate record. And that situation is changing as well. We're finding that teamwork platforms are becoming vital and certainly integral in the arterial collaboration of every organization. And finally, historically, organizational information was predominantly on-premise, and with the advent of cloud and remote working and all of these new paradigms that we're seeing, that is less and less the case. Most organizations these days are hybrid. And so what we have to accept is that we need to be able to take a step back and take a look at this new landscape holistically. And what we mean by that is a lot of organizations are focused on security and identity, and they are producing a point solution that will migrate their identities to the cloud, and endpoint security that will protect their cloud environments. But really, that security and identity strategy needs to take into consideration teamwork, and it needs to take into consideration collaboration with vendors and customers and internal stakeholders, and it needs to take into account a lot of other things. And so more and more we're finding that organizations need to take a step back and say, what is my combined strategy for teamwork, records management and compliance, collaboration, and my cloud strategy? And so that brings us to the big question of the webinar, I guess, and that is, so what do we do about it? And what we'd like to propose today is 8 steps that you can make to start, that you can take to start to make information an asset. The first of those steps would be a strategic decision that would need to be made. And certainly if information strategy and information governance and compliance and managing your information effectively are all things that you are seeking out within your organization, you would want mature data management. And that's what you can see on the left-hand side of this slide. And that's an IT initiative, and it has very good practices that you would undertake in order to mature that pillar. Things like understanding stewardship of information architecture, who owns what piece of information, determining processes to collect, validate, store, organize, protect, process, retain, and destroy data, data quality management strategies, data warehousing strategies for business intelligence and analytics, metadata management so that we have information about information that allows us to more easily manage and discover info, data accessibility policies, and data security management. And I'm sure within your organization, as you're listening now, you could identify many parallel efforts that are perhaps aimed at these objectives. Besides that, though, there is a strategic information governance imperative, which is a business imperative, which an organization needs to undertake. And that is a decision to have a strategic information governance practice that will help the organization reach a vision from an information perspective. And these kinds of questions that would be asked when pursuing this strategically would be, what constitutes data? Where is it collected and used? How accurate must it be? Which rules must data follow? Who's involved in the various stages in a data lifecycle? And what is the value of information to our organization? Getting all of these questions answered and undertaking to have an operational framework that help you manage your data more maturely, as well as a strategic framework that will help you steer the information governance ship towards the right horizon, is the first step in making information an asset for your organization. The second step is to assess the current landscape and to understand where you are currently. The first step of any journey is knowing which direction to head out in, I guess. And there are a number of things that you can do to start to measure the maturity of your organization in different pillars, most of which we've discussed in previous slides. Things like a security and identity assessment, a compliance assessment where you identify the types of regulations that are important to your organization and how to achieve them. ECRM assessments that look at record schedules and the maturity of those schedules and the systems around them. A teamwork assessment that assesses how folks are working with one another. An information landscape assessment which looks at on-premise information as well as cloud information and how these information repositories are managed. And finally, a cloud readiness assessment that looks at the organization's journey to cloud and where it is on that stage. And certainly, as a step two, it's a good idea to have a good measurement of where you sit from a maturity perspective in all of these avenues in order to determine how you get from point A to B in terms of your compliance. Step three may be a surprise, and that is to understand your people. So what we found is that the best way to understand the flow of information and informational needs within an organization is to understand and document the types of people who work with that information. We're talking about understanding the types of roles that work within specific teams as well as in isolation. What are their responsibilities and the challenges they face? What are their needs and wants from an information ecosystem? What does a day in their life look like? What are the scenarios that would play out as this person expedites their job from a teamwork perspective or from an information management perspective? What are their device needs? And so forth. And the process of going through this will help an organization to really understand how information is developed within the org itself. Understanding the roles, however, is not the only thing that we have to acknowledge, because even within a single role, there will be different generations, and different generations have a different level of comfort when it comes to interacting with technology in specific ways. You'll find that certain generations will prefer face-to-face meetings, and other generations will gravitate towards emails. Others are quite comfortable with instant messaging. And so within a role itself, we have to also acknowledge that there will be different folks inside of that role who would like to interact with the organization's information ecosystem in very different ways and should be able to. And that brings us to step 4, which is understand your information. I think we would be remiss if this step wasn't in here somewhere. But essentially what we're talking about is documenting the types of information that the organization works with. Now, we're not talking about a conclusive effort to track down every single piece of information within the org and rubber stamp it. What we're talking about is attempting to get at that 12% at the top of the iceberg that we saw on a previous slide. The process of doing that really means breaking down and understanding what types of legal documents we have, and operational documents, and departmental documents, and financial documents, and whatever else may be unique to your organization, and spelling out what these types of information are. The process of doing that brings us to an opportunity where we can start to correlate those types of information with our record schedule, understanding that our record schedule as it stands, which may be an amalgamation of requirements from different regulations, whether they are state, local, federal, industry specific, related to PII, whatever the case may be, but essentially represents what we have to do as an organization in order to mitigate our liability through a solid record retention process. And finally, as the third part of step 4, what this enables us to do is get to that place we were discussing previously, where you can document the entire life cycle of each document. Bearing in mind, we're talking about the critical business info here, and perhaps a little below the surface to start to understand some of that rot data that may be reusable, properly categorized, can be analyzed in order to benefit the business. We want to try and reach a place where we can say, for each of these documents, we know how it's created, who creates it, where it is created, while it's being authored, we know whether or not it must be versioned, whether it's co-authored, whether there's an approval process. And if that document is shared, we know who has view versus edit rights, and are they external versus internal, and does that sharing expire? If the document is archived, we know whether it needs to go to a central location so it's easily discoverable for reuse. And we know who can access it, and we have an idea of how long that archive period should be. And finally, then transitioning now into the record keeping space, we know what the relevance of this document is from an e-discovery perspective. We know what kind of disposition review would be required when reviewing whether or not the document should be destroyed. We know whether or not that document disposition for a specific type of document would require something like tombstoning, which is defensible disposition. In other words, the document was discovered on this date, and we kept a receipt that lets us tell you that that is what has happened. And finally, what that allows us to do is get to a point where we can create a navigable information landscape. And what that really means is that if we have an understanding of what our document taxonomy looks like, and we have an idea of how that is related to our record schedule, and we furthermore know what the life cycle of all of those documents look like, we can start to think about where those documents fit into the organizational information ecosystem. The word intranet has become a little bit of a non-depart, but essentially, if you think of this as an intranet type structure, you may have a home page where employees can go to start to explore the types of information that are available. And if I was an employee who had just joined your organization and was looking to understand the types of policies that existed, I may navigate through the list of departments to HR, and within HR, I might find that list of departments. If I'm a member of the IT department who is newly appointed, I may go to the IT department's homepage and find a list of projects there. And clicking on one of those projects, I would be challenged and said, this is a members only area for managing this project. Would you like to contact the project owner? And in doing so, what we're doing is creating a discoverable and navigable information ecosystem, which is of value to folks because it allows us to discover that which we do not know within the information ecosystem of the organization. Step 5, I hope you're all still with me. The next step is to understand your processes. So one of the things that you'll realize as you start to map out roles and start to map out your information ecosystem and the life cycle of the documents and so forth is that documents generally have a life cycle in which they are owned by different teams at different stages, or that different teams need access to it, and so forth. And so the process of documenting what these types or what team processes would look like help us to understand what types of changes in teams would be making to information, how they collaborate while expediting these processes. But this also offers us an opportunity to build in some automation. And that's a good opportunity to save money for the organization, in that automation will remove a lot of the menial things that can be automated, getting digital signatures, converting documents into a different format, distributing documents for approval. All of these types of things are good opportunities to build in place some document automation processes, which will help ensure that the information flow is, first of all, as low admin overhead as possible, but also that it is productive and efficient for those who are incumbent in that process. And step 6, finally, we'll reach a point, understanding our processes, understanding our information ecosystem, and understanding the types of roles for folks who are working within that ecosystem, to be able to build a view of the types of teams that we have inside an organization. And there's different types of teams that have different life cycles that we'll start to find within the organization when we do this. The reason we want to do this is because if you don't think about the life cycle of different types of teams, and folks create teams as and when they need them, what you'll find is that 8 months down the line, 12 months down the line, after starting this kind of team collaboration environment, you have dozens and dozens of teams. And it's very difficult for an IT department to look at a team and go, well, there hasn't been activity on this team for 4 months. Does that mean I can delete it? Do I know what kind of information is inside of that team? Could it be things that need to be moved into a central location for reuse, so knowledge management? Could they be things that need to move into a records management system for retention and disposition? And so taking the step up front and saying, we recognize that there are strategic teams within our organization and perhaps departmental teams that are around for as long as the department is around. And as people join the department and leave it, they will become members of that team. Perhaps we have transient teams which are centered around a campaign and end when the campaign ends, or event-focused teams which are only around for a few days after a specific event occurs. Perhaps there are project teams which are centered around resources and timelines and budget and those types of things. And what happens when that project team closes? These are the types of questions you want to be asking as you create these types of team templates. So in the case of the project, when the project closes, perhaps some of the information goes into a central project repository where it is accessible to the entire project management office for reuse in future projects. And perhaps a portion of it, the contracts and so forth, go directly into a records management system. These are the types of things you want to understand so that as you look at the types of teams within your organization, you're able to say, I know that this team has a life cycle of approximately 12 months, and that it's nearing the end of that 12 months, and that the critical event, which signifies that we need to start thinking about how we archive and how we retain the information inside that team, is the project deadline or the project closing date. And so, as part of step 6, documenting the team profiles, we can ascertain what the goal of the teams are, who the owners, contributors, and observers are, whether they need guest access, what the qualification criteria for a team is. Perhaps a team requires a billing code before it can be formed. Security and access maps, the onboarding process, and finally the individual roles within the team. And this allows us to make really good determinations with regards to what to do when we sunset the team and how to manage the team lifecycle. And that brings us to step 7, where we have enough information to start to build a blueprint and a roadmap. And essentially the types of things that you would want inside of this informational blueprint and this roadmap that tells you how to get there are things like a business glossary that standardizes the types of terms that people use for information within the organization. An information taxonomy, which breaks down the information, and which we saw on a previous slide. The record schedule, which we've discussed as well. Data quality definitions, identifying where the sources are of information, what the processes are within them, what the stores look like and what systems interact with those stores, a strategy for rot and dark data, a compliance and governance journey. In other words, we have ascertained that we have a compliance level of X on this regulation, which is important to our organization, and we in the next 24 months aim to be at X compliance, and these are the steps that we wish to do from a remediation and attestation perspective to get there. Roles, responsibilities, stewardship, identity, security strategy, sharing and accessibility strategy. All of these things are components that you would want in your blueprint and roadmap. And essentially what you're looking at is a way to get from where your organization is now to a place where you have the information governance and compliance that you need in order for information to be an asset and for the liability of information to be adequately managed. And finally, step 8. You are now armed, if you reach this point, to determine your informational ROI. And this is a really useful metric because no one wants to spend money on information without understanding why we're doing it. But if you think about it, if you've reached this point and you've done your due diligence to get to this point, you're in a really good position to justify what the return on investment on solid information governance practices and strategy might be. You could include in that ROI things like the cost of storing dark data and rot. If you're able to significantly diminish the costs of storing that information and managing it, that is a good metric to include in your ROI. You can measure the potential liability of a data breach and use that as a driver for a business case for informational governance. You can determine the financial exposure of non-compliance, whether it's from an industry or regional global perspective. You can estimate the productivity gains from efficient document discovery and reuse. I saw an article the other day with a scary statistic that says almost 1/3 of the average employee's time is spent either searching for information or otherwise recreating information that already exists. Imagine if 30% of that time could be recaptured through more efficient data management practices, discoverability of information, and the ability to reuse info. You can determine the impact of system simplification and increased clarity. The less data we have inside of systems, the more easy it is for us to pick up trends, the less duplication we have, the less cleaning we need to do. And the fact is that a higher average value of data is equal to a higher return of value on data. So the average value of your data, by cleaning up your data and only having data that is of value, that 37%, you're able to get much closer to being able to use information, only having critical information that's worthwhile to drive business decisions. And finally, the value of organizational knowledge management. Knowledge management is only as good as the knowledge that is in it. Decreased data processing costs, simply because there's less data. Decreased costs within other subsets of data management. If you have business analytics or a set of data scientists who are very expensive resources, if the information that they are using to determine or feed their models or produce AI-driven decision-making for an organization is good data, and there's less time required by those high-profile resources in order to clean up the data, that entire model is just more valuable. And finally, lower overall cost to protect and secure information once there is less of it. And using all of these determinations, you can build a solid case for ROI for an organization in terms of the benefits of having solid data practices. And that is our 8-step program. Todd, I don't know if you want to say a few words before we move on to the next few slides.
Well, the first 3 words I'd like to say are thank you, Ryan. Every time I see this stuff, I look at this 8-step thing, and it's so appropriate and effective, those 8 steps. For folks on the call, I'm sure you've heard some version of, description of information governance, the various approaches, models, etc., and how important it is before. This discipline is not new, but given this shift to how information is managed, the information landscape, the requirements continue to change. And part of smart compliance is making sure we stay ahead of that shift so we can provide real tools that work and attack things like information governance. Who would have thought we've been talking about identity and teamwork and how they can no longer be treated as silos? So great job, Ryan. Thanks a lot. If you want to go to the next slide here. I know Maggie is really excited about this. Ryan, you are as well. The smart compliance offer that we're going to offer for our guests today. But before we do, I just want to recap, because this is such a great show with our topic today. The new information landscape, it is a lot to take in. To me, it's kind of like the driver and the disruptor in the industry. You've got all of these great tools, solutions, ways to collaborate like never before, and we still have the same requirements and additional requirements, but we can't let go of the technology. So I think the key here is to acknowledge it, 1, prepare for it, 2, and continue to adapt to it. And that adapting, in my mind, includes a shift to our outcome as a service, which is going to support things like adapting to this modern workplace that Ryan has described, adapting to COVID times that we're all in right now, developing business at record speeds with low barriers. That's what we're talking about here, not having things stop production, but increase production. But along with that, as Ryan has showed us, there's lots of cons that we must consider, like too much email. The new landscape offers plenty of gaps for data loss. Increased InfoGov risk and productivity decreases. It's kind of like, be careful what you ask for. Again, acknowledge it, prepare for it, plan it. Assessing, strategizing, and planning are the key. And with that, I think we want to help some folks start planning. So here is a huge bonus of taking in our webinar today from Ryan.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, so what we want to offer everyone who's joined us today is a free 4-hour workshop. We're doing one per week over the course of the next few months. Obviously, we'd be handing those out on a first come, first serve basis, and customers would need to be nominated for that. But it is essentially a session hosted by a cloud architect and an information governance expert. And some of the takeaways of this process are: there's a pre-workshop survey that helps us to achieve at least a baseline litmus in understanding the types of information that folks work with and where they're currently at. Essentially, we do an information repository scan and analysis of some of the information that the organization has to show how you could identify different types of info within those silos. We assist in evaluating information management maturity across all of the disciplines and practices that we've spoken about. We provide a cloud migration roadmap, an information governance and compliance blueprint. We introduce some tools for compliance and processing and knowledge, which organizations should be aware of. We demonstrate effective information ecosystem design, as well as demonstrating Teams governance. And all of these are a product of this highly focused workshop that we are very pleased and excited to offer everyone.
Fantastic. Can't say enough about that offer. I think we have, we're at a good point where we could turn this over to Q&A with Maggie. Maggie, are you with us?
I am.
Hello.
Okay, so Brian, I'm going to start you off easy. First one comes from Jim. How many spaces are available for the workshop?
So obviously space is limited, and we are going to do it on a first come, first served basis. Our intention is to do one workshop a week over the next few months. If we find that there is a huge demand, then we will take that into account. We surely want to help as much of our friends and the folks who've joined us here today as we possibly can. The fact is that if it is of interest, you should probably get in contact with us, and we'll figure it out with you.
Okay, next one. How can you manage security risks in the current work from home environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is technology that is helping us to do that. Certainly there are technologies that we can have on mobile devices that help protect the information that is on those devices. We can use things like multi-factor authentication. We can use good measures that allow us to continuously identify differences in trends for accessing information. So if I've just logged on in one country and I suddenly log in another country, it's an impossibility for me to have traveled between those 2 points and to be logging on as myself in both places. This type of analytics helps us assist it. I suppose a good way to answer it is that there are technological mechanisms in place, and certainly those technological mechanisms are very, very effective in protecting information. The place that it might fall short is not being sure what type of information you're protecting. So we see lots of situations where the type of information that is being managed by an employee might include today's lunch menu, and it might also include a highly valuable piece of intellectual property. If we can't differentiate between those two, then our ability to protect that information is diminished. So I suppose part of the answer is the great tools that we're seeing, AI-driven security, and mobile devices that have bioscanners on them so that we can use our fingerprints to identify ourselves. That's part of the solution. The other part of the solution is knowing what we're protecting, where it is, and being specific about the granularity of the type of information that we're seeking to protect.
All right, and this is going to be the last one. How do you start to structure data intranets without sprawl?
The answer to that is a broad one. What we showed here was a process of understanding the types of roles, understanding the types of teams, understanding the types of information. All of those once you have them properly cataloged and you have them broken down, enable you to start to think about how you want to structure your navigable information experience or your intranet. Ordinarily, we find that organizations gravitate towards their departmental structure because it's the most natural. So you might start an intranet by saying, okay, well, we at least know which business units own which projects and which business units own which types of information and so forth. We can therefore create this intranet that allows us to navigate to those departments and work in that way. What we find, though, is that even if you start with that out of the gate, you'll find that you identify location-specific requirements and that you might have information that gravitates towards location-based hubs. You may have technology-specific hubs, employee hubs. You may find that it's important for you to differentiate between different sales regions, whatever the case may be. Essentially, that information ecosystem should gain a life of its own. And you should structure it in such a way, and there are technical terms for this without getting too far in the weeds, things like hub and spoke design, that allow us to identify how we would be able to, over time, decide that we want to take a specific site or area or business unit or whatever the case may be and move it somewhere else. And certainly as part of your ongoing information strategy would be understanding how that navigable ecosystem would evolve over time. So that's a bit of a mouthful. I hope that all made sense, but essentially you expect that to be a living thing that changes regularly, and it should really be a reflection of the organizational structure as well as the things that are most important to an organization, and flexibility there is key.
I thought
Ryan,
it was
that
great.
yeah, and that totally makes sense to me. I'll just add a little bit onto that. What we are experiencing in the industry with clients who have gone down this path, those things that you're talking about may have been neglected on the front end, but they're finding that they're really needed now that they either are in a team sprawl state or they want to improve. And it all kind of with effective goes back to having defined policy procedures that have been crafted around having all of the right players at the table, kind of like what you just described as your org chart approach, and then leveraging the technology, because now you can make it where, you know, everyone just doesn't get to create a team because they think they need one. Maybe there's a few litmus test questions up front that can be answered to understand what is the purpose of the team, where will it be placed, what are the dynamics around it, and so on and so forth. So this will be a subject that continues to get a lot of attention moving forward. Okay, and if there are no more questions, Maggie, I think
Nope.
we are ready to close it up on the final slide, because that's going to do it for today. I'd like to thank Maggie and Ryan today. Thanks for all the great intel. Ryan, as always, enjoyed it. Thank you, Maggie, for helping out, and thanks everyone on the call for attending. We hope that our webinar today has provided you with insight on our outcome-focused approach to smart compliance to leverage your 365 investment. If you like what you've seen, please reach out, contact us, follow us on social media. And as a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email notification for today's webinar replay. Stay safe, folks, stay healthy, and we will see you soon.